Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Our first lecture today is really more about phonetic classification. We discussed voicing, we discussed place, we did have a bit of discussion of manner, so we look at that in greater detail today, and in particular we look at some of the special characteristics of English plosives. The classification of manners of articulation is based upon the notion of stricture, as it's called. Do sit down at the back. Thank you. When two organs of articulation are brought close together, they can either form a complete closure, or they can have a closure that comes and goes, or is partial, or they can have a mere narrowing without a complete closure, or they can just be vaguely in the region of one another without even much in the way of narrowing. And this gives us our degrees of stricture. Complete closure, complete stricture characterizes plosives, nasals, and affricates. You have intermittent closure in the case of trills and taps, flaps if you have them. We have partial closure in the case of laterals. We have narrowing in the case of fricatives. And we have mere approximation in the case of approximants. So let's look at each of these in turn. First of all, complete closure. This is what we have in plosives. There are pictures for a P sound and a T sound, respectively a bilabial plosive and an alveolar plosive. And you can see in the picture the two lips entirely together, so that the air coming up from the lungs through the larynx into the mouth is blocked by that complete closure. The soft palate, the velar, is also raised, preventing the air going through the nose. So we have a moment during which the air cannot escape at all. That's why in the middle of a word like happy, there is a moment of complete silence. If I prolong it, listen, happy. During the moment of complete closure, lips closed, air blocked in every way from escaping, there is silence. And in fact, the essential auditory feature of voiceless plosives is a moment of silence. We identify them, of course, by the onset and offset, by the sound immediately before and the sound immediately following, as the lips come together and then separate. Here is the picture for a T sound of English. You notice the place of articulation is alveolar in English, unlike the dental place we have in some other languages. But the point is, again, that there is complete closure, complete block to the flow of air. Now, trills and taps are not really necessary in English, but it's useful to know about them from the point of view of general phonetics. I don't know how many of you can make a trill. An alveolar trill is ra, 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 ra. Those of you who are speakers of Spanish probably can. The others may find it problematic. Speakers of Italian probably can too. It's also possible to make a uvular trill. Ra, 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 ra. Again, depending on your language, who speaks of French or German may be able to do this, or may not really be able to do that very easily. You could probably all make a bilabial trill. Can you do that? That shows what's going on. Now, it's very important to note that when you do You're not doing ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. In other words, a trill is not a quick sequence of plosives. It's an aerodynamic arrangement where you have the organs in question held in a fairly elastic but fairly relaxed way. The air pressure blows them apart and their elasticity brings them together again. Well, as I say, this is not really relevant to English because we don't use trills in ordinary English. They very occasionally be heard in sort of the dramatic effect in declaiming classical poetry or classical drama, read round, but it sounds pretty artificial in English. A tap is just a single touch of that type. Here is a diagrammatic representation. This is from Ashby and Maidman's book, and you see at the top a schematic representation of a plosive where the organs come together, stay together for a moment, and then separate. With a tap, it's just a momentary touch. If I bring the tongue tip up to the alveolar ridge, as in a D sound, da, but quicker, ara, ara, we have just a single touch and a bounce straight away. That's what we call a tap. Ara, ara, ara. This is the R sound of Japanese. This is the tap of Spanish, pero. And it's a very quick sound, as you can see. Again, we don't really have this in English. 100 years ago, yes, people did use this for R between vowels when they used to say very sorry. But nowadays we don't say very sorry, we say very sorry with an approximant. Trill, of course, is when you have multiple touches. And if we get somebody Spanish to say a word like carrera, you will notice first a trill and then a tap. I think from the moment you better just accept my imitation of Spanish. But Spanish has both trills and taps. Good, you like it, that's fine. And that's the difference between them. Let's move on to partial stricture. This is where we have a closure in the midline, tongue tip on the alveolar ridge for an L sound, a lateral, but the air can escape round the side. If you make an L and hold it, you ought to be able to feel the air escaping at the side. If you hold everything still but then breathe in, you should feel cold at one or both sides of the mouth. Yeah? I think most English people make an ordinary L sound bilateral, that is, the air escapes on both sides, although it seems to be sufficient to do it on one side. That's a lateral then. English L, of course, is alveolar. It's possible to make other kinds of lateral. Some of you have in your language a palatal lateral, ya, ya, made somewhat further back. It's possible to make velar laterals, not involving the tongue tip. It's also certainly possible to make bilabial laterals. But no language is known to use them. I think it's important for Japanese people struggling with the difference between R and L to understand clearly what is involved in a lateral. This lateral escape, the L sound always has the air escaping round the side of a central block, whereas the R sound has the air coming down the central channel. Then, narrowing. This is the kind of stricture we have in a fricative. There's a picture of an S sound, and you can see the narrowing between the tongue tip and the alveolar, well, tongue blade as well as the alveolar ridge. Not complete closure. There is, of course, closure at the sides, but there is a channel that is free for the air to pass. Now, when we say narrowing, the point about this is that it has an auditory effect. because as the air is forced through this narrowing, it is rendered turbulent. And this turbulence is what you hear as friction. So, and so on. You can hear the noise of the air being made turbulent as it goes through this narrowing. If the narrowing is not sufficient to give turbulence, you won't hear anything. So that's the crucial point about narrowing. It's combined, of course, with voicing, in the case of voiced fricatives, and so on. If there's not enough narrowing to create turbulence in the airstream, then the result is just an approximant. English R as in red is like this. Red. Red. In fact, English R is very interesting, because if you then compare the R of red with the R of tread, or the R of dread, you'll see the difference between approximant and fricative. Because when it's together with a T or a D, English R is fricative. Tree, try. If I stop on the R, likewise dream, dry, draw. You have friction there and you can hear it. Unlike the plain in red, rise, roar, and so on, where there's no friction. So it's just a matter of how close the tongue tip is to the alveolar ridge. What's the difference, going back to complete closure, complete stricture, what's the difference between a T or D sound and an N sound? Well, you see the difference in the picture, like one of those puzzles where you compare two pictures that look nearly the same. Crucial difference between da 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 and na 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 is the position of the velar, the position of the soft palate. Can you see how on the left it's raised, forming a closure against the back wall of the pharynx, so that air can't get into the nose. Air doesn't pass through the nasal passage, so you have in fact complete closure to the airstream, can't escape anywhere, da 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 da. But in the case of na 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 na, the soft palate is lowered. There is a gap between the soft palate and the rear wall of the pharynx, so that the air can stream into the nose and indeed out of the nose. And when you say and na 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 na, the air can escape freely through the nose. You can test this very easily by pinching the nostrils when you go na 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 na. Just try doing that, na 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 na. Whereas if you pinch the nostrils when say da 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 da, it doesn't have much effect, because the air isn't going through the nose. So that's the crucial difference between plosives and nasals. So this now gives us a table of the different manners of articulation for the English consonants. We have the plosives, sometimes called stops, which have complete obstruction, including the raised soft palate. We have fricatives, which have narrowing. In the case of H, the narrowing is perhaps not more than approximant narrowing, and that's at the glottis anyhow. Affricates, we must say a word about. Affricates start off like plosives with complete closure, but then they change into fricatives with mere narrowing, as the organs of speech slowly separate. And the TR and DR sequences we discussed in try and dry are also affricates phonetically in English. Nasals, as we saw, have complete closure, but with the soft palate down. So manunga are like budaga, but with the soft palate down. If you say morning with those three nasals, but you have a very heavy cold, so that your nose is blocked with mucus, what's the result? Instead of morning, you say good morning. Morning. And that's the corresponding plosives, of course. So that's the relationship between them. This is important too for speech therapists children who have problems, for example, because of a missing soft palate or an inadequate soft palate, cleft palate, can't cut off nasal escape. So everything is nasal. So when they try and say bad, the result is bad with nasals. If they try and say 6, they have to say th, th, because they can't make fricatives. You can't make plosives and fricatives without raising the soft palate. In the case of liquids, L's and R's, the airstream is either diverted, as in the case of the lateral, or modified, as in the case of the approximant R. I have to say that the category liquid is not really a very well-based phonetic category. It's more of a phonological category because in many, many languages R and L behave in similar ways, pattern similarly. You get sound changes involving a change from one to the other, or one direction or the other. And so they clearly belong together in terms of how the language operates. But from the point of view of their articulation, they're not an obvious category. The term liquid is almost really a mistranslation into Latin of a Greek word that meant something like ambiguous and referred to the way they behave in versification in classical Greek. Lastly, then, the semivowels, these are approximants, made like vowels. Vowels are all approximants as well, but the point about the semivowels is that they're not syllabic sounds. Vowels are syllabic, semivowels are not. Two useful terms. One which refers to plosives, fricatives, and affricates as a group. They're called obstruents. And it's very helpful to be able to refer sometimes to the obstruents because they behave similarly to one another. In English, they come in pairs of voiceless and voiced. And they're the ones where we have to worry about lenis devoicing. The antonym is sonorant, or some people say resonant. These are the nasals, liquids, and semivowels, the sounds that are not obstruents. Again, they behave similarly. In English, they're all normally fully voiced. If you have a word like lemon, no devoicing of any of the sounds in it. Woman. Consisting, as they do, of nasals, liquids, and semivowels, plus vowels. Okay, now let's look in more detail at plosives. I did touch on this the other day. We can identify 3 stages in the production of any plosive. The approach, the beginning, during which the organs concerned come together. The articulators approach one another. Then there is a period during which they remain in contact. That's called the hold, the central part. And then they separate from one another. That's called the release, as the articulating organs move apart. Now, what is very interesting in English is that in certain positions, plosives don't have an approach or don't have a release for reasons that we're going to look at. They have to have a hold because that's the essential part, but the other ones are negotiable. And in particular, many English plosives have odd or unusual or absent release characteristics. And this is why it's very important with English plosives to think about the beginning of them, but not so important to think about the end of them. And that's also true in terms of recognition and perception of plosives. Affricates are just the same, except that in the case of the affricates, as we saw, the release is gradual. Instead of sharply separating, as a plosive would, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, in the case of affricates, cha-cha-cha-cha-cha, we get a slow release. Speakers of Japanese, I wonder if you're aware that your T and D sounds, your alveolar plosives, automatically turn into affricates before a close vowel. Your close vowels are E and U. So what happens to ta before E? It becomes chi, that's an affricate. What happens to a before u? It becomes tsu, that's an affricate. So Japanese has a rule changing plosives to affricates before high vowels. English doesn't have that rule, but I thought you'd like to know about it. And it shows us the relationship between plosives and affricates. Now, special releases. Well, this is set out in a table on your handout, part 4, a table of various kinds of release that we find in English plosives. And perhaps the most important difficult release is what we call nasal release. Before we look at release, though, it's perhaps easier to start with nasal approach. This is on the handout, but not on the screen. So look at the examples given on the handout. We've got the word temper, to be in a bad temper. Think about temper. Think about the P sound in temper. What is the approach to that P sound? Okay, I've said tem. Now I want to make a P. What do? Tem. Do I do anything with the lips? Tem. No. Temper. For the M and the P together, there's only one single movement of the lips. Temper. So the transition from M to P must depend on something other than the lips. What does it depend on? The soft palate and the vocal folds. We have to go from having a nasal, the M, to having a plosive, the P. And the crucial difference is at the soft palate. So that's what we do with the associated change in the voicing. If we take the second example, amber, there we don't have to worry about the voicing change. There the change is purely one of the soft palate. Amber. I think everybody can say a word like amber with no problem. Now, don't make yourself sick, but if you try and say amber, the mb bit, and reach back with your tongue tip to feel the soft palate. Can you do that during the M? Can you feel the soft palate? Sort of soft at the back of your mouth? What about change from M into B, as in the middle of an amber? Perhaps you can feel the soft palate suddenly isn't there anymore. It's raised. It's flipped up out of the way, and you can't reach it anymore with your tongue tip. Well, depending on how long your tongue is and so on, how good you are at these things, you may or may not be able to feel that. But in principle, it's there. And of course, we could easily show it with an X-ray or some other kind of instrumental investigation. All right, we've got nasal approach then in the case of temper and amber. We've got nasal approach in the words enter and under, because again you say under with just a single articulatory gesture of the tongue tip. Nobody would dream of saying under, make and break the N, make and break the D. We all know that you make an N, turn it into a D, and then release the D. Under. Just say under, see if you could feel that. Under. Okay, and I think in all your languages there are instances of nasal approach. But not all languages have the other way around, which is nasal release. This is what we have in a word like suddenly, or good night. Good night. Now, some of you may find it difficult to say good night because you want to say good night. But that's not what we do. Just as in under, we make the ND sequence with a single articulatory gesture, adjusting the soft palate in the middle, so with the DN sequence of good night, we make a single articulatory gesture with the tongue and adjust the soft palate in the middle. It starts raised for good, then it has to come down for the end. Good night. Good night. The tongue tip stays still. Good night. Try and say good night and feel that. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. On the handout we've got some other examples. Let's take the word submit. To submit an application. Submit. Do we say submit? No, we don't. The B turns into an M. Submit as a soft vowel. Submit, 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 submit. Nasal release. Submit. Try saying submit. 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 One of your internal organs is your kidney. Kidney. It's not kidney. Kidney. It's kidney. 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 Try it. Kidney. 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 Now, the further complication is that sometimes the N is syllabic, somewhat longer. That's what we have in sudden and suddenly, 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 suddenly. Now, in fact, it's not such a disaster if you put a vowel in and say suddenly, making two separate alveolar gestures, but you don't sound very native-like if you do that, because we certainly say suddenly, 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 suddenly. And you've got this DNL sequence without any movement of the tongue tip. Adjustment, if you think about it, first of all of the soft palate, and then of the sides of the tongue, to get from the N to the L. We'll come to that in a minute. On the handout, I've put a little box around the examples, hidden and common, because those are the two cases that people typically find rather difficult. In hidden, there's really no way out. Hidden sounds childish or foreign. You've got to do hidden. In the case of cotton, there is an alternative because many people, many English speakers nowadays use a glottal stop instead there. Cotton, cotton. And in that case, there's no nasal release because the air is held behind the glottal block for you to adjust the soft palate ready for the air in cotton. If you find cotton easier than cotton, by all means say it, it doesn't matter which. The last two lines give you more examples that may have glottal activity. If you have stop plus me, basically stop me, stop me. One single bilabial gesture, stop me, stop me, stop me. If you like, you can reinforce it with a glottal stop and say stop me, that's also acceptable, stop me. What we don't normally do is say stop me, separately releasing the P. Just practice saying stop me, stop me, stop me, stop me, stop me, stop me. And words like atmosphere. Now, very careful or old-fashioned pronunciation would indeed be atmosphere, but usually atmosphere nasal release or atmosphere glottal. Atmosphere, 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 atmosphere. That name. Again, most people by now use a glottal stop in this phrase. That name. Nasal release is also perfectly good. That name. But on the whole, don't do that name with separate release. He's back now, with or without glottal reinforcement. Okay, that's nasal release then. It's something worth practicing if you find it difficult. That's just to remind you of the difference between them. As we go from D to N, what we have to do is adjust the soft palate. Good night. Good night, good night, good night. You're going from this position for the D to this position for the E. Can you see my finger? No, you can't. From that position for the D to that position for the N. Okay, the next one is lateral release. Now, you know about the difference between D and L. Just remind yourself, in a da, there's closure all the way around. Tongue tip to alveolar ridge, side rims pressing against the sides of the roof of the mouth. Da, 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 da. In the lateral, on the other hand, an L sound, la, 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 la. The air can escape freely at the sides because the side rims are not raised, just the tongue tip. Just practice saying la, 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 and do D's, da, 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 feel the difference. La, 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 la. Right, to get from one to the other, we have to adjust the side rims of the tongue. So in the phrase, good luck, Good luck. We make the D, closure all the way around. Good. Then we release the side, one or both. Good luck. And that turns it into an L. Good luck. Good luck. Good luck. Good luck. So not good luck, but good luck. Good luck. Good luck. Try that. Good luck.
Good luck.
Good luck. Good luck. Again, it may be helpful to approach this from the point of view of lateral approach. So look at the examples on the handout. We've got the words alter and builder. Now these have an L followed by a D, and if you make the lateral for the builder, to get from the L to the D, what have you got to do? Raise the sides of the tongue. Build, builder, 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 builder. You keep the tongue tip in place. So that's lateral approach. The other example here, it's all done. The slight complication here, of course, is that the L is dark, velarized, and increasingly people in the London area don't really make a lateral, but just produce an O vowel instead. So this example will sort of falls apart. If you say builder, we haven't got lateral approach because we haven't got a lateral. But in the classical and more usual pronunciation, builder, we have lateral approach. So what we have to do in good luck is to do that the other way around. Start with the complete closure, then move to the lateral, the partial closure. I've got some more examples on the handout. Atlas, where you have a T and an L. Again, many people use a glottal stop. So where I would say Atlas, you'll also hear people say Atlas. Some people say Scotland, others say Scotland. Do whichever you like. You can have both lateral release and glottal stop if you like, and say Atlas, Scotland. So it doesn't matter. However, the DL sequence is very important because it's very frequent across word boundaries in connected speech, as in good luck. It comes in the phrase I'd like. What would you like to do? I'd like to go swimming. I'd like, I'd like, I'd like. Many foreign learners do not distinguish between I like, present tense, general applicability, and I'd like, would plus like, means at this moment. If you say I like to go swimming, that's a general statement about what you like doing. I'd like to go swimming means now. That's my suggestion for what we should do next. And they are different in sound, they should be, and different in meaning. And I'd like, meaning I would like, requires lateral release. Just practice saying I'd like, I'd like, I'd like, I'd like, I'd like. Okay, the biggest problem seems to be when the L is syllabic, so boxed on your handout are the examples of lateral release into a syllabic L, middle, and little. Middle. If you find this really very, very difficult, well, you can use the vocalized O instead and say little, and you will sound like Londoners. Okay, well, we've got there the example bottle, which ideally should have lateral release from T to L, bottle. Londoners might say bottle. But that's sort of socially stigmatized. Before we come on to this, which actually we talked about the other day, let's just look at the handout for the examples of no audible release. When we have one of the words that ends in a plosive at the end of an utterance, then we often just don't bother to release it at all. Or we release it in a way that you can't hear. So if I say stop, I don't have to do at the end of it. It's enough to say stop, stop, stop. And then I stop pushing with the lungs. I've got to open my lips in due course, but you don't hear any release. Practice saying stop with no audible release. Stop, 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 stop. Yes, I think you can do that. Stop. Right. Right, right, right. Same thing, no audible release, right. And of course, many people use a glottal stop, right. It's very difficult to hear the difference between alveolar and glottal if there's no release. I mean, it's difficult anyhow sometimes, but particularly difficult if there's no release, because you have to judge it by the formant changes at the end of the vowel, which are very subtle and so on. But that's what it is. That's how we pronounce it. We say right, 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 right. And likewise with final K. Have we got an example? Yes, back, back, back. Can release it, back, back, back. But we often don't. Back, back. So your perception task is to be able to perceive the difference between PT and K even when unreleased. So can you hear the difference between lip, lip, and lip? The first one, lip, is lip. The second one, lip, is lit. The third one, lick, is lick. But often you have to recognize them as best you can. And of course, if you can see the speaker, you can make use of visual cues. So, lip, you see my lips together. Lip, lick, you don't. Can you hear it even when you can't see it? Lip, that was lick. Lip, that was lip. Lip, that was lit. Very difficult. There is actually usually a tonal difference. Lip, lip, lick, to exaggerate it. Bilabials, it seems, drag the tone, the pitch of the voice down a little bit. Velars raise it a little bit. And this is how tones seem to have developed, for example, in Vietnamese, which used not to be a tonal language, but now is a tonal language. So those of you who speak tone languages, Cantonese and so on, maybe this is another way of identifying them, I don't know. Well, this applies, of course, not only to the voiceless sounds, but also to the voiced ones. Again, on the handout, we've got examples with final voiced plosives. We've got the word cam. Doesn't have to be cab, can just be cam. Good, good. Doesn't have to be good, good. Big, doesn't have to be big, that's big. Again, we English people, when we speak foreign languages, we have to reverse this. We have to remember to release final plosives. If I'm speaking German, I mustn't say gut. I have to say gut, I think. It's better with a released sound. Okay, release masking. There's our captain with a mask P and our doctors. Have I got a picture of this? No. So you have to remember about release masking, how it is. We've got the approach, the hold for the first plosive, the P in the case of captain, the K in the case of doctors. And then during that first hold, we make the articulation for the second plosive, the approach for the T in each case. And there's a moment of double hold, two places of articulation simultaneously, cap. Of course, all you hear is a longer silence than the release. So what you hear is a bilabial approach in cap, and an alveolar release in T. Captain, captain. Or a velar approach in doc, and an alveolar release in ters. Doctors, doctors. Captain, doctors. More examples on the handout. Abdicate. Good boy, good girl, big boy, back down, stop doing it. Some of these can also undergo assimilations, which you'll be told about at a different time, but not all of them. Now, what happens in a phrase like good dog? Good dog, good dog, good dog. Well, What doesn't happen is good dog. We make, in fact, just a single articulation for the two Ds, good dog. Phonetically, really, it's a single plosive, but with a long hold. You have an approach for the first D, good, a long hold, and a release for the second D, good dog. Not good dog, which would be a single D, but good dog, good dog, good dog. This is easy for speakers of Italian, who have the same thing in Italian, easy for speakers of Japanese, who have the same sort of thing in Happak and whatnot, but may be difficult for some other people. But note that we certainly don't say good dog. This is what we call gemination. We get a single long plosive instead of two separate ones. You can get a change in voicing, bedtime, Vila's big girl, bilabial stop pushing, that table, bookcase, gemination each time. There are a big girl, and a bus stop. Just see if you can say big girl, not big girl, but big girl, big girl. Try it. Big girl, big girl. Be careful, by the way, not to use a glottal stop here. Don't say big girl. It isn't big girl, it's big girl. Glottal stop for the voiceless ones, okay, but not for the voiced ones. In fact, we have very much the same thing with fricatives, except because they're not plosives, we can't talk of approach, hold, and release. But in a phrase like bus stop, we get a long S. Bus stop. Bus stop. We don't get bus stop. Bus stop. No, we get bus stop. Bus stop. Bus stop. However, tiresomely, in the case of affricates, we don't get a long affricate, we get two affricates. So in which plus cheese, we have to say which cheese. Which cheese? Which cheese? In orange juice, not orange juice. Orange juice. So affricates are an exception. Affricates you have to say fully. Except in some kinds of West Indian English, which you don't wish to know about. Look back at the handout. There are also some examples here involving nasals. Some men, that gives you a long M. Some men, we don't say some men, but some men. 10 names, long N. All lost, long L. Staff fund, long F. That's what we've had. And then more affricates, which cheese, orange juice, teach juniors, even if there's a change of voicing. You can't say T juniors, but teach juniors, teach junior high school, teach. Okay, the last thing we need to look at a bit more is this business of glottal reinforcement and replacement. Now, glottal closure with one of these plosives PTK can take two forms. Either you have a glottal closure as well as the other closure, bilabial, alveolar, or velar. That's called glottal reinforcement. Or you can have a glottal closure instead of it. And that's called glottal replacement. That's a nice schematic statement. The truth is more complicated. What seems to be very important is whether or not the glottal closure masks the release. There's a world of difference between atlas, where you have a glottal closure at the beginning, and atlas, where you have a glottal closure at the end, or instead of the alveolar closure. The first one we call reinforcement, the second we call replacement. Whether or not there's actually an alveolar gesture, if we can't hear it, we can speak of replacement. And this glottal replacement is becoming very widespread for syllable final T. So we have, particularly if there's a following consonant in a word like football, it's actually very common to use a glottal articulation alone. Footprint. So it could be footprint, but that's very fussy, old-fashioned and careful and whatnot. Or it could be alveolar where you can't hear the release, footprint, that's what that symbol means, footprint, footprint, or with glottal stops, footprint, 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 footprint. Likewise, button with nasal release, or button, a button with glottal stop. Okay, the T is the one that is most susceptible. The others that can have reinforcement or replacement are the voiceless plosives. We can certainly reinforce a ch, say teacher, but you don't want to know about that because you probably can't hear it, and it doesn't matter whether it's there or not. Some people, that is, say teacher, glottal stop first, teacher, teacher, teacher. Others say teacher, 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 without it. And it doesn't matter at all, both are entirely acceptable. When you've got a P at the end of one word followed by a bilabial at the beginning of the next word, such as a soup plate, that's the sort of place where people often use a glottal reinforcement, soup plate, or even replacement, soup plate. But you'll also hear it, for example, in the name of the month, April. People saying April, 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 April. You don't have to imitate this, but that's what's happening in case you hear it, April. April. Similarly with a K, certainly in a phrase like bookcase, a word like bookcase, book plus case, bookcase, reinforcement, or even replacement. And then in a word like accurate, you'll often hear reinforcement, accurate. This is a fluid situation. We're changing the environments in which you get this phenomenon, keep changing, and haven't settled down, so it's probably best just to ignore it. But I thought you'd like to know about it. Thank you very much.